There is a multi-billion-dollar industry built around convincing you that your health depends on products invented within the last 50 years. Supplements engineered in laboratories, powders derived from things you cannot pronounce, capsules that cost more per month than a week's worth of groceries, and yet, 3,000 years before the first vitamin tablet was pressed, before the first clinical trial was designed, before the word antioxidant existed in any language, ancient peoples were growing, harvesting, and eating specific vegetables with a precision that modern nutritional science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. Today we are counting down 13 vegetables that appear not only in ancient scripture, traditional medicine, and indigenous healing practices around the world, but that have since been validated by nutritional research in ways their earliest cultivators could not have articulated but somehow understood. Pay close attention to number 1. It is a vegetable so ordinary that most people walk past it in the market without a second glance. But the mechanism by which it supports kidney and cellular health is one of the most counterintuitive findings in recent nutritional biochemistry, and it was written into one of the oldest agricultural texts in human history. And when we reach number 7, I want to tell you about a moment recorded in the book of Daniel, a story of survival, physical transformation, and a 10-day test that would change the way royal courts fed their most valuable people for generations. What the researchers found when they finally examined what Daniel and his companions were eating is not what most people expect. Number 13. Scallions. In the book of Numbers, chapter 11, the Israelites wandering in the wilderness did not cry out for bread. They did not mourn the absence of meat first. The very first thing they named the food that made them weep with longing was a list of vegetables they had eaten freely in Egypt. Among them, specifically named, were leeks. In Hebrew, the word is shatzir, and the scallion family, the young green onion, the slender shoots that appear weeks before a full bulb forms, belong to that same ancient lineage. What the Israelites remembered was not simply flavor. In a culture where food was inseparable from medicine, where what you grew determined what survived your family through illness and season, these green shoots represented something irreplaceable. Traditional Chinese medicine incorporated scallion roots and white bases, the parts most people today discard immediately into preparations for clearing cold and supporting kidney yang. Ayurvedic texts from the same era referenced green alliums as agents of warmth and circulation. Persian physician Ibn Sina, writing in the 11th century, described the diuretic properties of allium shoots with clinical specificity. The modern science explains the mechanism. Scallions contain a compound called quercetin, a flavonoid that research has associated with reducing inflammatory markers, including some implicated in early kidney stress. They also contain camphorol, a lesser-discussed flavonoid that has been studied for its potential role in protecting kidney tubule cells from oxidative damage. 100 grams of raw scallion provides more vitamin K than almost any other common vegetable, a nutrient critical for preventing the calcium deposits in soft tissue and kidney tubules that contribute to stone formation. Studies suggest the sulfur compounds in alliums, particularly allicin precursors, may support the kidney's filtration efficiency through their influence on blood pressure and vascular tone. Take the green tops, do not discard them, and the white base together. Chop them finely and steep in warm water just below boiling for 8 minutes. Add a thin slice of fresh ginger. Drink this in the morning before eating. The flavor is mild, slightly grassy, with a soft warmth from the ginger. This is not a tea that announces itself dramatically, it works quietly. The Israelites wept for this plant in the wilderness. They did not know what quercetin was. They knew what its absence felt like in the body. Sometimes that kind of knowledge runs deeper than any trial we have designed to measure it. Number 12. Arugula. The Romans called it eruca. They grew it specifically for two purposes, as a food and as what their physicians described as a plant that warmed the kidneys and encouraged the body to release what it no longer needed. Columella, the first-century Roman agricultural writer, noted that eruca was never to be grown near rue because together the warming properties became excessive. That observation, made 2,000 years ago, reflects a pharmacological intuition about herb interactions that modern herbalism still references. The same plant appears in medieval Islamic botanical texts as jarjir, described by Ibn Sina as strengthening to the urinary organs and useful in conditions involving sluggish elimination. Jewish texts from the Talmudic period, listed among the bitter herbs of Passover. In some traditions, the bitter greens, eaten as a reminder of hardship and as a physical stimulus to digestion and cleansing. What arugula contains that its ancient cultivators could not name is a glucosinolate called glucoarusin. When arugula is chewed and broken down, glucoarusin converts to arusin, a compound that researchers have studied for its effects on nitric oxide production in the body. Nitric oxide is essential for vascular dilation, including the dilation of the small arterioles that supply blood to the kidneys. Inadequate kidney perfusion, inadequate blood flow to the filtering structures, is one of the early and underappreciated contributors to chronic kidney stress. Arusin's role in supporting that circulation pathway is the subject of continued peer-reviewed investigation. Arugula is also rich in calcium, but unusually, it is also rich in the compounds that help regulate calcium metabolism, rather than simply adding calcium to the bloodstream, a distinction that matters significantly for anyone with a history of kidney stones. Harvest young leaves no larger than 2 to 3 inches. Older leaves, especially those grown in heat, concentrate the glucosinolates at levels that can become harsh. Cold steep a handful of young arugula leaves in filtered water for 6 to 8 hours in the refrigerator. The result is a subtly bitter, cool green water with a gentle, peppery finish. Drink it first thing in the morning before any other food or beverage. The bitterness is the mechanism at work. The Romans did not have clinical trials. They had 2,000 years of daily observation about what happened to the kidneys of people who ate this plant regularly versus those who did not. The biochemistry is now beginning to give those observations a language. Number 11. Kohlrabi. This vegetable has almost no presence in popular health content, which is precisely why it belongs here. Kohlrabi the swollen, stem that looks, as many first-time gardeners note, like something from another world, was cultivated in northern European monastic gardens from at least the 9th century. The monasteries of the medieval period were the hospitals of their time. What was grown in those gardens was not accidental. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century Benedictine abbess and one of the most rigorous natural physicians of the medieval world, documented brassica stems as cooling to the body's internal heat and useful in conditions she described as arising from the blood becoming too thick or too burdened. She was working without a microscope. She was describing, in the language available to her, what we now associate with inflammation and filtration burden on the organs. Kohlrabi belongs to the brassica family, the same family as broccoli, cauliflower, and kale. It contains a class of compounds called indole, 3-carbinol and its derivative, dim, or diindolylmethane, which have been studied for their role in supporting the liver's phase 2 detoxification pathways. When the liver detoxifies effectively, the filtration burden on the kidneys is reduced proportionally. The relationship between liver function and kidney health is one of the most important and least discussed areas of organ support nutrition. Kohlrabi also contains significant vitamin C, but critically, the compound concentrates most heavily in the peel, the part that most modern recipes instruct you to discard. Peeling kohlrabi before eating it is the nutritional equivalent of throwing away the most important part. Eat the peel. Wash it thoroughly. Slice kohlrabi skin intact into thin rounds. Press the slices gently with salt and allow them to sit for 20 minutes. Rinse. The salt draws out excess moisture and softens the cellular structure slightly, making the nutrients more bioavailable. Eat them raw with a small amount of cold-pressed olive oil and a squeeze of lemon. The flavor is crisp, mildly sweet, and faintly mineral. Hildegard did not know about indole, 3-carbinol. She knew what she observed over decades of caring for the sick. The research is now building the molecular explanation for what she already understood. Number 10. Lettuce. This requires a moment of historical correction. In popular culture, lettuce is considered the most nutritionally inconsequential vegetable filler. Color. crunch. But the lettuce that ancient civilizations cultivated was not the pale, water-bloated iceberg of modern supermarkets. It was wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa, and its close cultivated relatives, dark leaf, Bita, with a milky white sap that has been studied for compounds with sedative and pain-modulating properties. In ancient Egypt, lettuce was sacred to Min, the deity of fertility and abundance. Temple murals at Karnak depict lettuce, offered at altars, but the Egyptians were not offering it symbolically. They were growing it for its sap, for its seed oil which they pressed and used medicinally, and for what their physicians described as its cooling effect on the organs that process heat from the blood. In traditional Chinese medicine, lettuce varieties, particularly the darker bitter types, were classified as supporting kidney yin, the cooling, moistening principle that counterbalances the body's heat-generating metabolic processes. Kidney yin deficiency in TCM presents with symptoms strikingly similar to what modern medicine recognizes as early chronic kidney stress: excessive nighttime urination, lower back, aching, difficulty maintaining adequate hydration at the cellular level. The science points to something the Egyptians handled with their bare hands: lactucin and lactocopacrin, the bitter compounds in wild and romaine-type lettuces, have been studied for anti-inflammatory properties at the cellular level. The darker the lettuce, the higher the concentration of these compounds. Romaine lettuce grown to maturity contains significantly more nutritional value than harvested baby leaves. And its outer leaves again, the ones most often discarded or composted, contain 3 to 5 times more lutein and beta-carotene than the pale inner leaves. The carotenoids in dark lettuce support vascular integrity, including the microvasculature of the kidneys. Eat the outer leaves first. Never discard them. Choose the darkest varieties available: deep red romaine, Malabar lettuce if you can find it, any variety with visible pigmentation. Dress with cold-pressed oil and an acid lemon or raw apple cider vinegar to increase the absorption of fat-soluble carotenoids. What was sacred in Egypt was not mysticism. It was careful observation across generations, recorded in stone. Number 9. Mustard greens. The mustard seed appears in 3 of the 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke each record the same teaching, that something with this seed's seemingly insignificant beginning could grow into something providing shelter and sustenance far beyond what its origin suggests. Scholars debate the theological dimensions of that parable endlessly. What they discuss less often is that the plant itself, mustard, in its full leafy form, was a primary medicinal green in the ancient Near East, used for chest conditions, for what practitioners described as moving stagnant fluid through the body, and for what we would now recognize as supporting lymphatic and renal drainage. Ayurvedic medicine classifies mustard greens as pungent, heating, and drying qualities understood to move fluid, stimulate circulation, and support the elimination of what the tradition calls ama, the metabolic waste that accumulates when digestion and filtration are sluggish. Traditional Cherokee medicine used wild mustard greens as a spring tonic, specifically for kidney clearing after winter, the logic being that the cold months slow circulation and allow metabolic byproducts to accumulate in ways the kidneys struggle to process efficiently. The phytochemical story in mustard greens is extraordinary. They contain sinigrin, a glucosinolate that breaks down upon chewing into allyl isothiocyanate, the compound responsible for the characteristic heat. But allyl isothiocyanate has also been studied for its ability to inhibit certain enzymes involved in inflammatory signaling within kidney tissue. Mustard greens also contain alpha-lipoic acid, one of the few dietary antioxidants that is both water and fat soluble, allowing it to function throughout the full range of cellular environments, including within the mitochondria of kidney cells. Research suggests alpha-lipoic acid may help regenerate other antioxidants, including vitamins C and E, after they have neutralized free radicals, an effect sometimes described as antioxidant recycling. Wilt mustard greens gently in a pan with olive oil and 3 cloves of sliced garlic over medium-low heat, not high heat, which degrades the glucosinolates. Add a splash of apple cider vinegar at the very end of cooking. The acid activates the myrosinase enzyme system that converts the glucosinolates into their active compounds. Eat warm, as a side with the main meal of the day. The flavor will be deep, slightly bitter, with a warmth that sits at the back of the throat for a moment. The Gospel writers recorded the mustard seed as a lesson in scale. Ancient physicians recorded the whole plant as a lesson in what the body needs when it has grown sluggish. Number 8. Beets. In the Talmud, the tractate Ketubot includes a remarkable statement attributed to a group of sages who were asked about foods that support long life and health. Beets are among the foods specifically mentioned, and the reference is not casual. It appears in a discussion about which foods were served regularly in the households of those considered to live with unusual vitality and mental clarity. Roman physicians prescribed beet juice for fever and for what they described as heaviness in the organs of filtration. Byzantine medical manuscripts include beet preparations for conditions involving blood that had become too dense or too dark, a prescientific description of what we now associate with elevated hematocrit, viscosity, and certain inflammatory markers. What beets contain is one of the most significant nutritional discoveries of the last 20 years. Dietary nitrates found in exceptionally high concentrations in beetroot and to an even greater degree in beet greens are converted by bacteria in the mouth into nitrites, which the body then converts to nitric oxide. Nitric oxide dilates blood vessels. Specifically, it dilates the afferent arterioles, the tiny blood vessels that control pressure and flow into the kidney's filtering units. The glomeruli. Several clinical trials have found that dietary nitrate from beet sources may reduce both systolic and diastolic blood pressure, with effects researchers describe as meaningful enough to continue investigating as a dietary adjunct in kidney protective protocols. The leaves, the part that arrives with fresh beets and is almost universally discarded in modern kitchens, contain roughly 4 to 6 times more nitrate per gram than the root. Do not discard the greens. Eva. Juice the root raw approximately 4 ounces, with 2 stalks of celery and a ½ inch of fresh ginger. Drink it on an empty stomach in the morning, at least 30 minutes before eating. The ginger is not merely for flavor. It contains gingerols that work synergistically with beet nitrates to support circulation. The color will be deep magenta. The flavor will be earthy and faintly sweet, with a clean finish. Do not heat the juice. Nitrate compounds are stable, but some of the cofactor enzymes that support their conversion are heat sensitive. The Talmudic sages did not know about afferent arterioles or dietary nitrate conversion. They knew which tables in their community produced the oldest and most vigorous people, and those tables had beets on them. Number 7. Broccoli. The story the researchers did not expect to find. In the first chapter of Daniel, a young man arrives in Babylon as a captive. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, has instructed that his most promising captives be fed from the royal table rich food, aged wine, the finest provisions the empire could supply. Daniel refuses, not because he is ungrateful, not out of rebellion. He refuses because the food from the royal table has passed through rituals he cannot participate in. He asks the official assigned to oversee them for something different. What he asks for is vegetables and water. The official is afraid. He tells Daniel, "If you look worse than the other young men after 10 days, my head is at risk." Daniel says, "Test us for 10 days. Give us only vegetables and water. Then compare." 10 days later, the text records, and this is the word used in most translations, the 4 young men appeared healthier and better nourished than all the others who had been eating from the royal table. That is not poetry. That is a documented nutritional outcome from a controlled, if informal, comparison. Perhaps the oldest dietary study in recorded history, the vegetables Daniel would have had access to in the Babylonian context of the 6th century BCE included lentils, greens, and almost certainly brassica family plants that were well established in that agricultural region. Broccoli, as we know it, was developed later in the Mediterranean, but its ancestral brassica relatives were present and consumed throughout the ancient Near East. What the researchers found when they finally examined the glucosinolate content of broccoli, specifically a compound called sulforaphane, is that it activates a transcription factor called NRF2. NRF2 has been described by researchers as the body's master antioxidant regulator. When activated, it switches on more than 200 genes involved in the production of the body's own internal antioxidant enzymes, including superoxide dismutase, catalase, and glutathione peroxidase. These are not antioxidants you consume. These are antioxidants your body produces in response to eating the right signal. The kidneys, which generate significant oxidative stress as a byproduct of filtration, depend heavily on these internal antioxidant systems. But here is what almost no wellness blog discusses. Sulforaphane does not exist in broccoli as sulforaphane. It exists as a precursor called glucoraphanin. The conversion requires an enzyme called myrosinase. Myrosinase is destroyed by cooking above approximately 70 degrees Celsius. If you boil or microwave broccoli, you are destroying the very enzyme that converts glucoraphanin into the compound that activates NRF2. The solution is to chop raw broccoli, chop it, because chopping breaks the cell walls and initiates the enzyme reaction, and then let it sit for 40 minutes before applying any heat. By that point, a significant portion of the glucoraphanin has already been converted to sulforaphane, and the conversion is heat stable. You can then steam it gently for 5 minutes without losing the compound you spent 40 minutes producing. Eat it warm, not hot. Daniel did not know about NRF2 or glucoraphanin. He knew, with the certainty of someone whose life depended on it, that the vegetables were the right choice. 10 days later, the outcome spoke. If this kind of ancient knowledge resonates with you, the places where scripture and science arrive at the same answer from completely different directions, hit like and subscribe. What comes next goes even deeper. Number 6. Turnips. Turnips were a survival food in the ancient world not because they were considered inferior, but because they were extraordinary at one specific thing, producing a reliable harvest in conditions where almost nothing else would grow. The Romans valued them so highly that Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, ranked turnips among the most important plants in the Roman agricultural economy. He wrote that they belonged in second place among vegetables, after grain, not third. Second, what Pliny noted medicinally was that turnips were cooling to the kidneys and useful in conditions involving the accumulation of fluid and heat in the lower body. Traditional Chinese medicine classified turnips as a food that moves dampness, the TCM concept that encompasses what we might describe as edema, water retention, and the buildup of metabolic byproducts in fluid-heavy tissues. The science centers on a pair of compounds that turnips contain in significant concentrations: glucosinolates, the same class of compounds found in broccoli and mustard greens, and a specific phenolic called p-coumaric acid. P-coumaric acid has been studied for its ability to inhibit certain enzymes involved in the formation of uric acid, which is the compound responsible for gout and a significant contributor to a specific form of kidney stone formation. Studies in laboratory models suggest p-coumaric acid may reduce uric acid production at the enzymatic level, a mechanism distinct from most dietary approaches to uric acid management, which typically focus on reducing purine intake rather than affecting the synthesis pathway. The turnip greens, again the discarded portion, contain significantly higher concentrations of this compound than the root, great raw young turnips, golf ball sized. Not the large storage roots, and toss them with the greens. A tablespoon of raw apple cider vinegar, a small amount of cold-pressed flaxseed oil, and a pinch of unrefined sea salt. Eat at room temperature, not cold. Cold suppresses enzymatic activity. The flavor of a young raw turnip is genuinely surprising, crisp, mildly sweet, faintly peppery, nothing like the fibrous roots that have given this vegetable its undeserved reputation. Pliny ranked it second only to grain. The modern world has nearly forgotten it. Those two facts together tell you something worth paying attention to. Number 5. Spinach. The Quran, in Surah Al-An'am, speaks of gardens from which the believers eat, produced by divine provision. And while no plant is named specifically in that verse, the broader Islamic medical tradition, codified by Ibn Sina and al-Biruni in the 10th and 11th centuries, elevated spinach spinach to a position of singular importance among leafy greens. Ibn Sina wrote that spinach opened obstructions in the liver and kidneys and was among the most suitable foods for those whose systems had become burdened. The same plant was recorded in Tang Dynasty China as a gift brought by diplomats from Nepal in 647 CE, and was quickly adopted into Chinese medical use as a cooling vegetable beneficial to the organs of filtration. Persian, Arab, Chinese, and later, European medical traditions independently reached the same conclusions about this plant. Spinach contains oxalic acid, which has led some nutritional commentators to suggest that people with kidney stones should avoid it entirely. This is an oversimplification that the research does not fully support. Oxalate from food requires calcium to bind to it during digestion before it can be absorbed or excreted. When spinach is consumed with a calcium-containing food, a small amount of tahini, a few almonds, or full-fat yogurt, the calcium binds the oxalate in the gut and prevents absorption. The issue is not spinach. The issue is spinach consumed without adequate dietary calcium in the same meal. Ibn Sina, who recommended spinach consumed with sesame, a calcium-rich seed, may have intuited this interaction 1,000 years before oxalate chemistry was described. Spinach also contains nitrates comparable to beets, significant amounts of magnesium, a mineral that directly inhibits the crystallization of calcium oxalate in the renal tubules, and a compound called patulitin, a lesser-known flavonoid that has shown anti-inflammatory activity in kidney cell models. Eat it raw, in moderate portions, with a calcium-rich accompaniment. Or cook it briefly 30 seconds of blanching, which reduces oxalate content by approximately 30% through leaching into the water. Ibn Sina paired it with sesame 1,000 years ago. The chemistry he could not have known gives him every reason for that choice. Number 4. Kale. In ancient Scotland and throughout the Celtic world, the word kale was so foundational to the concept of a meal that it became synonymous with food itself. Scottish households that had nothing to eat were said to have no kale. And this was not metaphor. Kale grew through winter when nothing else grew. It stood in snow and produced leaves. It was what kept people alive. The Celts did not have a written medical tradition in the way that Ayurveda or Chinese medicine did. But the oral tradition of what their plants were used for has been partially preserved. Kale broth with the leaves, the stems, and specifically the water the kale was cooked in, which most people pour down the drain, was given to the sick, to the elderly, to those recovering from illness. The broth was the medicine. The water you cook kale in contains leached water-soluble compounds, including significant amounts of glucosinolate breakdown products and a compound called sulforaphane nitrile, a precursor that some researchers consider more stable and bioavailable than sulforaphane itself. Do not discard the cooking water. The Scots were drinking it as medicine. They were extracting from the plant something that modern kitchens are washing away. Kale also contains a flavonoid called camphorol in concentrations that are among the highest of any common vegetable. Camphorol has been studied for its potential to reduce inflammatory cytokines, specifically interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, which are elevated in patients with chronic kidney disease and are considered markers of the inflammatory burden that accelerates kidney function decline. Several peer-reviewed studies have found associations between higher dietary camphorol intake and reduced markers of kidney stress, with researchers characterizing the evidence as warranting continued investigation. What cold does to kale is the last thing worth understanding. Below approximately 4 degrees Celsius, kale begins converting starch to sugar as a cellular antifreeze response. This is why kale harvested after frost tastes sweeter. But it is also why the cold-sweetened leaves contain subtly different concentrations of specific compounds than their warm weather equivalents. Traditional growers knew to harvest kale after frost for a reason they called flavor. The science suggests the reason runs somewhat deeper than flavor alone. Blanch, Kale for 90 seconds. Save every drop of the blanching water. Let it cool to warm, not hot. Drink the water as a broth, with a pinch of unrefined salt and a squeeze of lemon. Eat the kale with cold-pressed olive oil. The combination of the fat-soluble carotenoids in the leaf and the oil that carries them across the intestinal wall is the preparation the body was built to receive. The Scots called it simply food. Sometimes the oldest word for something is the most accurate one. Number 3. Radishes. Radishes appear in ancient Egyptian records as one of the foods provided to laborers building the Great Pyramid. Herodotus recorded the inscription on the pyramid itself, an inscription listing the onions, radishes, and garlic that were distributed to the workers, not gold, not precious materials. Radishes. This was not a minor detail of provisioning. Egyptian medical papyri, including the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest preserved medical texts in existence, document radish seed oil as a treatment for liver and what scribes called water disorders, a term that appears repeatedly in association with what we now recognize as kidney and urinary conditions. The black radish Raphanus sativus var. Niger was the primary medicinal variety. In traditional European phytotherapy, black radish was used specifically for what was called lithiasis, the formation of stones in the kidneys or gallbladder. This was not a fringe application. It was a mainstream clinical use, documented in European medical texts from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Hospitals in Central Europe maintained radish preparations as standard treatments for kidney stone management. The compound responsible appears to be a glucosinolate called glucoraphacetin, which is specific to radishes and is not found in other brassica vegetables. Upon digestion, glucoraphacetin breaks down into compounds that stimulate bile production, increase urinary output, and have shown the ability in laboratory studies to inhibit the crystallization of calcium oxalate, the most common component of kidney stones. The seed oil that Egyptian physicians use topically has now been analyzed and found to contain erucic acid and fatty compounds with demonstrated choleretic bile-stimulating activity. Eat radishes raw. Choose the darkest varieties you can find the black radish if available, or the deep magenta watermelon radish, or the red globe varieties at minimum. Slice thinly. Eat between meals on an empty stomach. The enzyme activity that converts glucoraphacetin into its active form requires no preparation beyond chewing. Herodotus was impressed enough by the radish inscription on the pyramid to record it. The Ebers Papyrus was detailed enough in its radish applications to fill multiple columns. Ancient physicians did not write in stone about things that did not work. Number 2. Cauliflower. Cauliflower does not appear by name. In the oldest texts, it was developed as a cultivated variety relatively late in the brassica family's long agricultural history, emerging in the Mediterranean around the 6th century CE. But the plant from which it descended, wild cabbage and its relatives, appears throughout scripture and ancient medicine under various names, and the Talmud specifically discusses the white head of the cabbage family as being among the most nourishing and protective of all garden vegetables. In traditional Ayurvedic medicine, white-fleshed brassica vegetables were classified as sattvic, a quality associated with clarity, purity, and balance of the mind and body. This is not a categorization that was made arbitrarily. It was made based on centuries of observation about how people who ate these vegetables regularly responded to illness, to mental burden, and to the physical demands of aging. What cauliflower contains that makes it unusually relevant to kidney health is a compound called indole 3-carbinol, which I mentioned in the context of kohlrabi, but cauliflower delivers it in significantly higher concentrations. Indole 3-carbinol has been studied for its role in reducing the burden of exogenous estrogen compounds, environmental estrogens from plastics, pesticides, and industrial chemicals on organ systems, including the kidneys. The kidneys filter estrogen metabolites, and emerging research suggests that the accumulation of synthetic estrogen compounds may be a contributing factor in certain inflammatory patterns in renal tissue. Cauliflower also contains choline, a nutrient that is critically important for kidney cell membrane integrity, but that almost no one discusses in the context of kidney health. Choline is a structural component of phosphatidylcholine, the primary phospholipid in cell membranes. Kidney tubule cells turn over at a significant rate, and adequate choline availability appears to influence the quality of the membrane structures in newly formed cells. Steam cauliflower for precisely 4 minutes. Not longer. Remove it from the heat while it is still firm. Toss it immediately with cold-pressed olive oil and a generous amount of fresh turmeric, not dried powder. Fresh, grated, finely. The piperine in black pepper, added here, increases curcumin absorption from the turmeric by a documented factor of up to 20. The combination of cauliflower's indole, 3, carbinol, olive oils, oleocanthal, and turmeric's curcumin is one of the most synergistically documented anti-inflammatory dietary combinations in current research literature. The Talmud called white brassica among the most nourishing. The Ayurvedic tradition called it clarifying. The research is now constructing the molecular explanation for observations that are more than 1,000 years old. Number 1. Bush beans. In the book of Genesis, chapter 25, Esau returns from the field famished and sells his birthright to his brother Jacob for a single meal. The meal Jacob was cooking is described in Hebrew as nazid adashim, a lentil stew, but the fuller account, read in its agricultural and culinary context, suggests the pot contained a mixture of legumes and vegetables, the field food that was being prepared, likely in a way that those preparing it ate regularly. Laterin 2, Samuel, chapter 17. When King David is fleeing and in genuine physical danger without food, exhausted, his forces extended a group of supporters, meet him across the Jordan River, and bring specific provisions. The list is precise: wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, lentils and beans, and honey. The beans are named specifically. Pole in Hebrew the broad bean, but the broader legume family this represents has been central to every agricultural civilization in the ancient Near East from the Neolithic period forward. What the supporters of David understood, what every ancient civilization that kept a standing population alive through seasons of scarcity understood, is that beans are not merely filling, they are metabolically complete in a way that other plant foods are not. Bush beans, specifically harvested fresh, at the immature pod stage, before the seeds inside have dried, provide something that dried legumes do not. The pod itself contains a full spectrum of chlorophyll compound, flavonoids, and fiber types that are largely absent or diminished in dried beans. The green pod contains quercetin and chiampherol in concentrations that support kidney filtration. It contains lignans, plant estrogens that, unlike synthetic estrogens, actually compete with and reduce the binding of harmful exogenous estrogens to receptor sites in kidney tissue, and it contains insoluble and soluble fiber in a ratio that supports the intestinal microbiome in producing short-chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate, that serve as the preferred fuel of the colonocytes, lining the gut, reducing the intestinal permeability that allows metabolic toxins to leak into circulation and increase filtration burden on the kidneys. The seeds inside fresh beans, the small immature seeds visible when pods have grown slightly past their ideal harvest point, contain lectins that can be mildly inflammatory when consumed raw. This is why every traditional culinary tradition that uses fresh beans cooks them, not to the point of mushiness which destroys the chlorophyll, the texture, and a significant portion of the flavonoids, but to the point of just tender. 4 to 6 minutes of steaming or blanching. Stop before the color turns from bright green to olive. The moment the color shifts is the moment the chlorophyll is degrading. Pull them from the heat while they are still the color of a spring field. Toss with cold-pressed olive oil, a squeeze of lemon, and a small amount of raw garlic allowed to sit for 10 minutes before adding the 10-minute rest after chopping or crushing. Garlic allows allicin to form from a lion before heat or acid can interfere. This combination of fresh beans, olive oil, lemon, and activated garlic has versions in nearly every Mediterranean food tradition going back at least 3,000 years. The supporters of David carried beans to a man in crisis. They did not bring him processed provisions. They brought him the food that the body could use immediately, completely, and without waste. Every item on this list exists in two forms: the living form, close to the earth, whole and unprocessed, and the diminished form cooked too long, stripped of outer layers, refined, stored until the active compounds have degraded, or consumed as a supplement that contains only the isolated molecule with none of the cofactors that make the molecule work in the body. The single principle that runs beneath every one of these 13 vegetables is this: the active compounds are concentrated in the parts most people discard, and they are destroyed by the processing that modern food culture assumes is preparation. The outer leaves of lettuce, the greens attached to beets, the skin of kohlrabi, the blanching water from kale, the chopped garlic allowed to rest before heat, the broccoli allowed 40 minutes between chopping and cooking. These are not details. They are the entire point. Ancient peoples did not peel, boil, and discard. They ate whole. They prepared carefully. They treated the vegetable as a complete system that the body knew how to receive because the body had been receiving it in that form for longer than any of our pharmaceutical traditions have existed. The question that stays with me, and that I invite you to sit with after this video ends, is this: if every civilization that independently examined these plants arrived at the same conclusions across thousands of miles and thousands of years without consulting each other, without shared texts, without clinical infrastructure, what does that convergence tell us about the relationship between the natural world and the human body? Perhaps the oldest nutritional wisdom was not primitive. Perhaps it was exact. If this landed with you, hit like and share this with someone you care about, someone who might benefit from hearing what the ancients already knew. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, and leave a comment which of these 13 surprised you most, and what do you want us to explore. Next, there are thousands of years of forgotten knowledge still waiting to be brought back into the light.